At 1 o'clock in the morning, on April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. The blast tore through the reactor building. The roof was destroyed. Concrete was thrown into the air and radioactive material was scattered across the plant. Fire broke out around the building, but only a few kilometers away, the city of Pripyat was still awake in places. People could see a strange glow above the plant. Some watched from their window, others went outside to see what had happened. They did not know that the reactor had been destroyed, and they did not know that the air around them was already contaminated. Chernobyl was a large nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Soviet Union. 4 reactors were operating at the plant. Nearby was the city of Pripyat, built in 1970 for the workers and their families. By 1986, almost 50,000 people lived there. There were schools, shops, a hospital, cinemas. Many people in the city worked at the power plant. For them, Chernobyl was simply their workplace. Nobody expected that one night would bring an end to the city. Reactor number 4 was RBMK reactor. It was a powerful, but it also had serious design problems. At very low power, the reactor could become unstable. The control rods also had a design flaw that could briefly increase the reactor's power when they were inserted. The workers operating the reactor that night did not fully understand how dangerous these problems could become. They were preparing for a safety test. The question was simple. If the plant suddenly lost outside electricity, could the spring turbine keep the cooling pumps running until the emergency generator started? The test had been attempted before, it had failed. This was another attempt. On April 25th, the workers began reducing the reactor's power, but the electricity grid still needed power, so the shutdown was delayed. Hours passed. By the time the test was ready, another team had taken over. The reactor power was reduced again. Then it dropped much lower than expected. At such a low level, the reactor became difficult to control. The workers tried to raise the power again. To do this, many control rods were pulled out. The reactor was now operating in an unstable condition, but the test continued. At around 1 in the morning, the workers prepared for the final stage. The turbines would be slowed down. The cooling pumps would continue running for a short time. The workers would record the results. Instead, the reactor began moving toward a situation they could no longer control. 1 o'clock and 23 minutes, the test began. The steam supply to the turbines was reduced. The turbines started slowing down. Inside the reactor, the balance between water, steam, and power was changing rapidly. The reactor became unstable. The workers pressed the emergency shutdown button. Control rods began moving into the reactor. They were supposed to stop the reaction. Instead, because of the reactor's design and the condition inside the core, the power increased even further. The increase was extremely fast, then came the explosion. The building shook violently. The roof was blown apart. The reactor core was exposed. Burning, a second explosion followed. Reactor number 4 had been destroyed. The first people to respond were the plant workers. Some entered damaged areas looking for colleges. Others tried to understand what had happened. Many did not realize how badly the reactor had been damaged. Then the firefighters arrived. They came from Pripyat and nearby areas. They were trained to fight fires, but they had no idea how much radiation they were facing. Their immediate job was to stop the flames from spreading. They climbed onto the roofs and began working. Some of the dark pieces lying around them looked like ordinary debris. They were actually pieces of the reactor. They were extremely radioactive. Several firefighters became seriously ill within hours. They were taken to the hospitals. Many died in the weeks that followed. By the morning, people in Pripyat could see that something serious had happened. Helicopters were flying over the plant. Smoke could still be seen in the distance. People stood outside and watched. But the city was still operating. Shops were open. People walked through the streets. There was still no evacuation. The authorities were trying to understand the situation. While radiation readings around the plant continued to rise, the people of Pripyat were still living only a few kilometers from the destroyed reactor. The evacuation finally began on April 27th. More than 1,000 buses arrived in the city. Residents were told to take only what needed for a short trip. Many believed they would return in a few days. People packed clothes, documents, and small personal belongings. Many left almost everything behind. Then the buses began leaving. Within hours, Pripyat was almost completely empty. Most of the people who left would never return there to live ever again. Disaster did not stop at Pripyat. Radioactive material spread across large areas of the Soviet Union and Europe. On April 28, high radiation levels were detected in Sweden. At first, Sweden officially suspected the problem at their own nuclear facilities. They soon realized that contamination was coming from the east. Other European countries began detecting radioactive material as well. The Soviet government eventually confirmed that an accident had happened at Chernobyl. By then, the outside world knew something serious had happened. The radioactive cloud moved with the weather. Rain caused contamination to settle more heavily in some areas. Food became a major concern, especially milk. In contaminated areas, livestock and food products had to be removed or restricted. Entire villages were evacuated. While the radioactive material was spreading, the Soviet Union began the cleanup. Hundreds of thousands of people eventually took part. They became known as liquidators. They included soldiers, firefighters, engineers, miners, and construction workers. Some removed contamination soil, some cleaned buildings, others worked directly around the destroyed reactor. One of the most dangerous jobs was clearing the roof. It was covered with radioactive debris. Machines were brought in, but the radiation damaged many of them. Eventually, people had to do the work. Workers were sent onto the roof in small groups. They only had short amount of time. A worker would run onto the roof, pick up a piece of radioactive debris, throw it into the reactor, and run back. Then another worker would go. The process continued until the roof was cleared. Helicopters crews also flew over the destroyed reactor. They dropped materials into the opening in an attempt to control the fire and reduce the release of radioactive material. The flights were extremely dangerous. The crews were flying directly above the destroyed reactor. The operation continued for days. Eventually, the fire was brought under control, but the reactor itself remained a huge problem. Inside the destroyed building were radioactive fuel and contaminated material. The site would need to be contained. The first structure built over reactor number 4 was completed later in 1986. It became known as sarcophagus. It was designed to contain the destroyed reactor, but it had been built quickly and was never meant to last forever. Decades later, a much larger structure was built over it. The new safe confinement was moved into the position in 2016. It covers reactor numbers 4 and was designed to contain radioactive material, while allowing workers to continue dealing with the remainings of the reactor. The work is still continuing. Chernobyl also had long-term effects on health. One of the clearest was increase in thyroid cancer among people who had been children or teenagers in the most affected areas. Radioactive iodine was one of the main causes. The disaster also changed the lives of the people who had been evacuated. They had lost their homes, their jobs, and their communities. Many spent years worrying about radiation and their health. For some, leaving their home was only the beginning of the disruption. They had to build new lives somewhere else. Today, Pripyat remains abandoned. The apartment buildings are still standing. Trees have grown through the streets and buildings. Schools and public buildings remain empty. The old amusement park is still there. Its Ferris wheel was supposed to open in May 1986, but it never did. The accident happened before the park would properly open. Now the wheel stands among the trees. Wild animals also live throughout the parts of the exclusion zone, but the area is not harmless. Radiation remains in the environment and contamination varies from one location to another. Some places are relatively alive, others remain dangerous. The Chernobyl accident also changed nuclear safety. It exposed serious problems with the RBMK reactor design and with the way the plant was being operated. Other reactors of the same time were modified. Safety procedures were changed, and Chernobyl became one of the most important case studies in nuclear engineering. But for the people who lived through it, it was not a case study. It was their home. It was their place, the way they worked. It was where their children went to school. Then in a single day, they were forced to leave. The explosion itself lasted only seconds. The fires continued throughout the night. Pripyat was evacuated the following day. The cleanup continued for years, and the remainings of reactor number 4 are still being managed today. More than 40 years later, the apartment blocks are still standing. The schools are still there. The Ferris wheel is still there, but the people who once filled those streets are gone. Pripyat remains as it left in 1986, slowly being taken over by trees and time. And at the center of it all, beneath a huge steel shelter, are the remains of reactor number 4.